what really happened in the past? What's our story, and how far back does our story go? And to begin, we're going to go back more than 12,000 years ago to this time known as the Younger Dryas, when ancient civilizations called it the Golden Age. It was a golden age of civilization when, you know, there's evidence we can find exclusively all over the world, which we're about to go over in a minute, for anyone who's skeptical, that there was actually a global advanced megalithic civilization that once existed that was connected all around the world, not in the way where we view today with all this modern technology with cars and trains. I don't think it was like that at all. But I do think that it was a global civilization based on, you know, extensive shipping and a much, much more advanced understanding of our planet, the solar system, the universe, consciousness, energy, all those things. When you start looking at what these ancient civilizations knew, the knowledge about energy and transmuting their consciousness and all these things we're about to go over, it really does seem like science fiction. Magic and all these things that a lot of us have been made to believe isn't real, when in fact it was real, and we've simply lost all of that over time. We've lost all of this knowledge of these ancient megalithic structures perfectly tuned to the energy ley lines of the earth. And all of these means where we're coming back at this from a place where we've gone so far the other direction that most people don't even think it's real. And I wanna do a quick shout out, because I want to always show the appreciation for so many other researchers and truthers that have come before me, because this is not just something where someone stumbles upon all this and they try to get this to this place all on their own. This is a team effort by all of us. It's a team effort by those who are here that have the objective and the eagerness to want to find the truth and not be stumbled across by all those things that hold us back. And so I want to give a quick shout out to some of the most influential people that have delved into this area specifically that I think deserve the most credit. And those names, and I highly recommend people look into their work because they deserve credit, are researchers like Brian Forrester, Robert Schoch, Graham Hancock, and Randall Carlson. You know, these men have looked at this from well, here were these megalithic ancient civilizations, and then here were these disasters that we could see. What happened? Is there a correlation with why so much is lost? And that's where this discussion is going to go. We're going to try to understand what actually was lost back then, and what did these ancient cultures know? What were some of the documents they left behind to help explain what has been largely considered nothing more than a myth and just fantasy for what has been now hundreds, if not thousands of years?
Yes, I'd concur. I totally agree with that. And Robert Bouval, Schoch, all of them guys. Randall Carlson is a top-notch geophysicist, if you ask me.
Absolutely. And they look at this from a scientific background. Randall Carlson he's an expert in geology. He understands how to look at rocks and how to look at climatology and changes and all these things that have occurred. And when they team up, people like Randall Carlson team up with Graham Hancock, and then Brian Forrester comes at this from looking at the megalithic side, and then Robert Schoch comes at this from looking at, you know, how were things aligned in places like Egypt, and what were these building practices they had back then. And that's where I want to start. I want to start by understanding, well, what was the purpose of all this? Why are there so many sites all across the world? You know, we travel from South America in Peru and in Bolivia and Tiwanaku, and then we go all the way up through the Americas with, you know, in Mesoamerica, you see finding the Mayans and the Aztec and the Toltec, and then going across the world to all around the Mediterranean, from, you know, places near Italy down through Lebanon, Baalbek, Lebanon, and right down through Egypt, Mesopotamia, Iraq, and Syria, all the way across the world into Angkor Wat, Southeast Asia. We see these megalithic civilizations all around the world. And what megalithic means is a single large stone block was cut. And that may not seem like a big deal at the surface, oh, you can cut a huge stone. But the problem with that is, how do you then move it? How do you move it after you've carved it and move it into place? And that's where so much of this mystery comes in. And so let's go to a place like Easter Island, where when we look at where they took the rocks from, they only had specific quarries where they were finding certain rocks. We go across the ocean, right nearby in South America, we see in Peru. What were these rocks? Were they just finding whatever stones they could and then carving them? No, in some cases, they were even going to acquire these stones, including places like Egypt, sometimes more than 20 miles away, sometimes more than 50 miles away, just to acquire the right amount of stone and rock. And the purpose behind that was, if you have a type of rock that is not only far less erodible over time to actually last, but rocks that have a crystalline silica component to them, quartz, okay? This is a major component to understand. These different granites that have large amounts of quartz in them, they are part of this entire idea of, not only could you build something that withstands and lasts due to erosion, but build something that actually has the specific change on the harmonic frequency of the earth, of the energy itself. And so you would pick specific types of rock that would reflect that. And that's what, when you go over things like that, and the meticulousness of what these cultures did to build these structures and to go find specific materials for it, everything was planned. Everything was precisely planned because they knew what they were doing. And that's one of the biggest points to understand about this, is that these structures are so meticulously built, and in some cases we couldn't even mimic them today, or with great difficulty. That therein lies the very purpose, is that they did them in that way for a reason, because they had a specific goal in mind. And what was that goal in mind, Steve? That goal was energy. That goal was harnessing energy and allowing a place that can focus energy to then assist with things like raising human consciousness, and even a thing in a situation like where you could harness energy to then use for the means of incarnation, to actually be able to travel through lifetimes into different bodies. Because really, that's what comes down to how we define ourselves here. It's not based on the physical body. It's based on this energy. It's based on this internal energy that we call our spirit or soul. When we do look at these civilizations all over the world, one of the things that maybe is a little bit lost with people when they're trying to put all this together to understand timelines is that there have been these different epochs. I like to call them epochs, or different time periods of advanced or sophisticated human civilizations, we'll call them. I'm going to lump these epochs into 3 different time periods. And some of those time periods are going to cover large areas. And the first time period could probably be broken out into multiple ones, but I don't think we have enough information yet to do that. And let me explain what those are. The 3 different time periods that we see, that we find direct evidence for, and the best evidence to show that, in my opinion, of anywhere in the world, is looking in Peru, specifically in places around Cusco, up through Machu Picchu, and even parts of coming into Tiwanaku in Bolivia, Pumapunku. What you find in places like that are these 3 distinct different building styles. Okay, and that right there is the key to this whole puzzle. Because when you look at it, you find this pre-Diluvian megalithic civilization, which was part of that global civilization that included Atlantis, all over the world, connected by these energy centers, pyramids, and temples. Okay, and we're going to get into this coming up in a little bit, but then you had these cataclysms happen through a combination of things that were going on with our solar system, our sun, and these changes that were going on with the earth. You had these cataclysms, okay? And we'll get into that in a second. And those cataclysms caused that advanced, sophisticated civilization to be essentially wiped out. Now, right after that was occurring, because some of these cataclysms and these earth changes were happening over the course of hundreds of years, if not over 1,000 years, okay? And what that means is that's a long time. It's a long time for things to happen. It's not like, oh, they get wiped out and boom, then nothing, and then we see this rise. There's these intermittent periods. That's what is the most difficult thing to understand about this, that we find is that there was this, I call it the Younger Dryas civilizations, which were essentially right after the Ice Age was starting to melt from these cataclysms. There was an attempt during this intermittence between disaster and all these things that were happening and climate change and all these things on the planet. There was this attempt to restart civilization again. And that's when you go to Peru outside Cusco, you see this second building right next to it. This building right on top of it that's almost as big, but not quite. And it's not quite as sophisticated either. And as you go, you see this gap that takes place. And this is what I call the post-Diluvian civilizations, where a certain amount of time later, we don't know exactly how long. In some cases, it could be thousands of years in some places. But we saw civilization then get restarted again, but with far less of an understanding of that knowledge of the past. So in Machu Picchu, in these places around Cusco, you find the 3 different distinctive building practices. And Brian Forster talks about that all the time, and he's spot on. And so what you find is, in Peru, we think of as the Inca are not actually what most people think. When Pizarro came down and conquered South America, what he was meeting were with the natives that he was meeting and talking with and then killing in many cases. He was meeting this descendants of the Inca. The royal Inca were actually only a small segment of the ancient Inca that were part of this royal structure, who not many of them were left. And that was only the descendants of what I was calling the Younger Dryas civilizations. I don't think that any of the descendants of the pre-Diluvian, the real masters, were ever left. We have no idea what they even looked like, but they've been depicted with beards and a lot of facial hair, in which the native people of those areas don't have. So there was these 3 different periods. And I want to go back to the whole pre-Diluvian thing, because when we look at the fact that, yes, I'm going back before 12,000 years ago, but I think especially based on cuneiform tablets, looking at the Sumerian king list, one of the most incredible pieces of evidence of all, talking specifically about how Eridu was the first place that kingship was lowered to long ago, before we can even almost before we can wrap our heads around it, something like potentially more than 50,000 years ago, maybe 100,000 years ago. We don't know, but at some point long ago, civilization was created here. It was created in the Fertile Crescent of Mesopotamia, near the mouth of the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
If you don't mind me cutting you off for a second, I'm just a little curious as to your opinion on the King's List and the amount of years they've each lived, and how it progressively got less and less, and what your opinion would be on that.
Yeah, that's okay. So we're talking, no one's never read the Sumerian King List that's listening to this. I highly recommend you read it, because it lists out these pre-Diluvian kings. And that's where this whole idea of, well, how far back does our timeline go? And the reigns that some of these kings ruled for was hundreds of years, sometimes almost 1,000 years, if not more. And for us to try to incorporate that and think of it, most people would say, well, that's not right. It was mistranslated. That's impossible. It's impossible. When we look over time, go look at something like the legend of Atanya, which is another cuneiform tablet, except instead of the Sumerian king list, which represents the pre-Diluvian civilizations, meaning before the flood, this represents the post-Diluvian civilizations. And because it strictly states that kingship was relowered again in the Sumerian king list to the city of Kish. And the legend of Atanya is all about Kish and this king whose name was Atanya there. And it was mentioned that he was going to be the architect of the new world that they wanted to create out of all this turmoil that was occurring. Now, Tanya, just like these other kings mentioned, like Atrahasis, who is this part of this pre-Diluvian time period, they lived for hundreds of years. And when you start looking at the different idea of, well, were these root races of different humans around the planet? Some had a lot longer longevity. Were they connected back to Atlantis somehow? Is this some kind of Atlantean DNA? And I believe, without a doubt, that when you look at the ages of the kings specifically in these royal bloodlines, I think that they were specifically chosen for kingship, like a Tanya and like Hammurabi, who became one of these post-Diluvian rulers of Babylon. Okay, they're all these chosen rulers, chosen by these beings, chosen by these great beings to rule over civilization, kingship, this model structure for everything in our reality, for how people will rule and how laws will be set up and how the structure of everything will be designed. That's what kingship is. It's literally the structure to reality itself. And that's why the Sumerian king list says that it was first lowered to Eridu, which is part of this ancient timeline long ago that was then destroyed, almost completely destroyed. There's almost nothing left of it. And then later, way later, it was then relowered again to Kish, and then Atanya was the king, and he had to create these architects, this new architect of the new world. To me, it shows every single time one of these epics occurred, where they tried to restart civilization after disaster, less and less was given. There was less of an influence over whatever those influences were, which we'll talk about in the past. It was less every single time. And that's why we see those 3 different building practices in places like, especially like Peru, where what we think of as the Inca, which aren't really the Inca, they're the descendants of the Inca. Their building practices were still impressive in terms of what we would think of as a primitive people, but they're nothing like the megalithic civilizations that came before them. And you can see that go look at old pictures of even Machu Picchu, one of the most popular sites in the world. When they first encountered that area, they mislabeled and misbuilt, put things back together wrong, because they didn't understand that it wasn't just one civilization. It was actually 2, maybe 3 civilizations that were actually existing there at the same time. And Steve, like, these sites all around the world that were focused on specific energy ley lines of the earth, focusing energy for temples and human ascension, all these things, that's the same type of understanding, this type of harnessing electromagnetic energy of the earth that Tesla figured out. And then, of course, his work was then suppressed and then hidden under the rug, because so much money is involved in energy and technologies, it's being largely controlled here. But we're just getting back to what was already understood thousands and thousands of years ago during these different human time periods. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that you're spot on when you're talking about that less and less has come back to us. And I believe we're in the dawn of a new era of enlightenment, and we are on the front lines, brother.
We're returning to where we became. Everything returns to where it began. We're returning back to what some would call the light that we've lost in this dark period of our civilization. And I want to bring up one more thing before we move on. I want to specifically talk about something that I haven't talked about that much that needs a lot more discussion, and that's Easter Island. Easter Island, when I was a kid going in school, we were taught that there were these people there known as the Rapa Nui, and they overfished and overcut down their trees, and they eventually destroyed themselves. And that's what we were taught. And the more you look at like what I just talked about around the world, but especially in places like we can see whatever was left in places like Peru, of these 3 different distinctive building practices and these 3 epics of humanity, these different time periods, that's the same thing we're finding in Easter Island. And more importantly, just like in Göbekli Tepe, how it's a buried site, when you first look at these moai, these enormous figurines on Easter Island that make it so famous, it's difficult to wrap your head around how enormous those heads are, especially when you take into account that most of those statues are actually buried underground. They're more than half of their bodies in many cases are still underneath the dirt. And so when you look at that, you say to yourself immediately, we're talking about something ancient, something so long ago that amount of time. People need to go look at how long it takes a layer of like an inch of soil to be created. We're talking about feet and feet and feet of material, that such a long time period has gone by, that these enormous structures that are sometimes well over 10, 20 feet tall were then buried by soil being built up over time. That's how ancient we're talking about. That's how old we're talking about. And these moai that cover the island, there's hundreds and hundreds of them. That's unbelievable. And why, right? Why would they build all of those statues all facing the same direction for no reason? Just in a very similar light, just like we find in places like Egypt, we find these huge statue figurines looking in a certain direction. And you go over to Mexico in the Toltec site, known as the Temple of the Morning Star, we find the same thing. These figures that are looking a certain direction often have a type of handbag in their hand and they're passing knowledge. These figures from the past that are shown all over the world. I think it's remnants to the influences that were given long ago that are lost now. And all that has been handed down from above that we no longer have access to any longer. And that has become a myth and is considered not even real in most of our society today. And one of those places as we transition here, Steve, is Atlantis. You know, Atlantis is the most famous ancient society location that people talk about in the world, because it's this idea of a perfect civilization that was then lost, and all the different means that went into how that happened. But we really have hard evidence to show that it was very real long ago. And so some of the best evidence we have for that comes out of Egypt and what used to be the land of Chem, which was specifically the pre-dynastic Egypt, which means pre-dynasty pharaohs. When I was talking about those structures all around the world, these megaliths, that includes obelisks too. Pyramids, obelisks, and other temples and buildings. But the obelisks, like we find in other parts of the world, were then written over by other pharaohs later on. You know, they took credit for them. The great pyramid of Giza, known as Khufu's pyramid, which I don't call that by. That was Pharaoh Khufu that tried to take credit for that entire structure, even though he had nothing to do with it. He was just a king that came later during these dynastic kings of Egypt, these pharaohs that then tried to take credit for the civilizations before them, and it was largely misinterpreted, if on purpose at all, by those who first found the sites when they were uncovering them. And so there was so much of our history that became confused because of the different time periods and epochs that happened. And so getting into Atlantis, we have this famous being named Thoth, who left all these writings back behind because he was this priest of Atlantis who then left during the destruction and went to what became later Egypt, which was the land of Chem. And he was this priest there that then created all the pyramids and the structures there, and was booted out later when they changed calendars from a lunar to a solar calendar, in which he then went to Mexico and became Kukulkan and Quetzalcoatl. But the point is, we have this ancient civilization known as Atlantis that Thoth gives us specific details about. He tells us all about the different principal islands. He says there was 7 circular islands that surrounded a central island, in which there was this famous city called Kior on this island known as Undal, in which he was born and he came from, or during that current incarnation, he says, which is a very important key point to bring up about this whole idea of incarnations. And then if reading into the different ancient history of Atlantis and the different things that happened there, you learn about this battle that was going on between Poseidon and Zeus, and how there's these really there's this battle that occurred called the Titans versus the Olympians, where the Olympians, being led by Zeus, ended up destroying the Titans and took over and created the archetype for the new world. I mean, I think that was a real aspect of looking of what occurred symbolically back in history, with this changing of power over between these different groups around the world, and subsequently the disasters that then destroyed them. And specifically, Atlantis it doesn't actually sink into the ocean as Plato described. A lot of it is a symbolic, metaphorical way to talk about it. When we look at how during the Younger Dryas period, when these disasters were occurring, where ocean levels were rising 400 feet to where they are now, that's how something could essentially be looked at as sinking into the ocean. If you're having ocean levels that are rising by 400 feet, you would essentially lose those structures, anything that's built at a certain level close to sea level. And that's why I want to bring up the very important point that may be really controversial, that some people may not like. But I do not believe that the Eye of the Sahara, this Richat structure, is the remnants of Atlantis, because of several very, very important points that I want to bring up. First is that Atlantis is always talked about being this maritime city that connected to the sea with everyone around them, okay? And whereas if you look at the elevation of the Eye of the Sahara right now, it's over 1,500 feet elevation. That's actually extremely high if you consider the fact that supposedly during Atlantis, ocean levels were 400 feet lower than where they are today. That would have made it even more difficult to be anywhere near the sea, because you'd be talking about something that would almost 2,000 feet up if you account for the different levels of ocean rise. So as much as I do think that structure could have historical importance in some aspects, I don't think that it's actually Atlantis.
I would agree with you on that. No, I would totally agree with you on that because of, first of all, the elevation like you just spoke of. A lot of people are hanging their head on that Eye of the Sahara.
Yeah, and geologically it wouldn't make sense. You know, some will say, okay, well, maybe it rose, 10,000 years ago to where, it's a higher elevation than it used to be. No, that happened millions of years ago. And that happened so long ago that it would be impossible to be incorporated into the timeline of what we see in ice core samples from Greenland, okay? And it would make sense that if we're taking what Plato said, where he says Atlantis was destroyed 11,600 years ago, it's fascinating to go see that you see correlation where Göbekli Tepe, which is a site in Turkey, was supposedly created 11,600 years ago, exactly the same date. Now, why is that important? Well, when Atlantis was being destroyed and a lot of these cataclysms were happening, we have overwhelming evidence from not only Thoth and talking about Egypt, but a lot of other places where this knowledge from Atlantis was then brought to different places of the world, specifically in Egypt and in a lot of places around Turkey and the Mediterranean. But it's specifically, we can see it in a couple places where it just really stands out. And that site to me is Göbekli Tepe, because when you look at the site, you dig down and you look at the archaeological evidence of what was there, pottery, people, how they lived, was it nomadic tribes? What was it? You find that yes, there were nomadic tribes there, but all of a sudden it went from nomadic tribes to extensive agriculture and the building of this in a huge site in almost no time at all. Rather than having this gradual buildup of what we think of how civilizations got there, we saw this jump start out of nowhere at the same time that Atlantis was being destroyed. Just as we're told that Kem, this land of Egypt, was also being built and created based on all this dissemination of information that was coming out of the destruction of one of these, you could call it the greatest gathering of information ever in history, Atlantis. It was the place where records of all of time of Earth's history were kept. And when it was destroyed by, we're going to talk about in a minute, we find that out in the Atlantic Ridge where it supposedly was, Plato says in the Timaeus and Critias that it was found west of the Pillars of Hercules. We know that the Pillars of Hercules is the Straits of Gibraltar. And just like if you look west of there, you find the Mid-Atlantic Ridge. Okay. That makes all the sense in the world if you think about if there was violent earth changes where ocean levels were violently changing and volcanic events were occurring and tsunamis and all of these devastating things were happening. If you were on a ridge where that pressure was being released, it would be the most dangerous place to be of all. And that's why Atlantis was completely destroyed. And it took time for other places to succumb to things like the violent changes in the climate and a lot of other things that were occurring during that time period. So you saw these migrations of these civilizations to other civilizations like Göbekli Tepe in Mesopotamia, where they were creating and attempting to restart all of these civilizations that were then lost again later. And then we look back at them and we think it's impossible, but it really wasn't impossible. It's hard for us to wrap our heads around it. That evidence that talks about what happened, we can find that evidence directly. Go look at ice core samples from Greenland, which is a snapshot of our atmosphere and our climate at that time. We can see that, wow, look at this, during the Younger Dryas period, right when the ice age was violently ending and all the ice was melting, here we have temperatures shooting up beyond anything we see in our climatological records, then plummeting and then rising up again, all over the span of about 800 years. These incredibly violent changes that were occurring on the earth. And that's what makes it even more difficult to comprehend. Look at some of these sites in Bolivia, Tiwanaku. They're found at such a high elevation that trees can't even grow there. And yet they were still wiped out too. So we're not talking about just water here. We're talking about such a violent change that was occurring with the earth during this Younger Dryas time period that it was enough to destroy civilizations that were so advanced that they understood the balance of nature perfectly. They understood agricultural practices precisely, how to grow things in the climates that they were in. They understood how to harvest things correctly, and yet they were still wiped out. That's why we need to look at today. Most people today could never even survive in the outdoors for more than a couple days. What would happen if we had something as simple as just knocking out the power grid to the world? We would be thrown right back into the Stone Age because we've become so dependent on technology that we've lost our way with understanding how to be balanced with the world around us. And that's why when you read a lot of these ancient writings on how to reach higher states of consciousness, you find that it's essential. And I mean that, I want to repeat that. It's essential that you understand and go back to your roots of your place on this earth and with the animals and plants around it and your place in the solar system and the stars. What is your place here? Are you in the survival of the fittest mentality where you're just taking whatever you want and destroying whatever you want around you with no repercussions? Is that how the human race should act, especially given what we are in our history? Or have we just gone down a dark road where we're at the same place where some other civilizations have been, where they were destroyed and lost? I think there's a lot of lessons that can be learned from looking at reading the Atrahasis and what they say specifically happened with these disasters that occurred. Reading the Epic of Gilgamesh, read the Sumerian King List, read the Legend of Etania, the stories of the Hopi and in the Bible about what happened where all these things were lost before. And we're just regaining those things now. And so that's why Atlantis is so important, because it represents this central city hub, I think, of what the world was at the time. We think maybe today of a place like London and New York City or all these different places as being is the commerce center or the capital of our world. I think Atlantis acted as that for all these ancient megalithic civilizations. And so that's why it's so important that we then take into account of what Plato said and what these ley lines were connecting these civilizations all over the world. Why were they all found on these convergence of energy? Is that just a coincidence? Or is that a piece of the puzzle for us to understand these structures? And so to do that, to understand the past, to understand what happened that we're missing, we have to understand what Thoth said, which was, remember, he was one of the main priests of Atlantis. He had all the knowledge of Atlantis. He's the one who jump-started Egypt, which was called Khem. And he's the one who then influenced, or at least one of the incarnations of, that helped influence, the Maya and the Aztec and a lot of these ancient cultures around the world. So to find out the answers, we have to read from what he left behind. And that was called the Emerald Tablets. Okay, and this was then carried over to later Hermetic writings were written by Hermes, which I believe was also an incarnation. As crazy as that may sound to some people, read what he says about his different incarnations and about how he essentially mastered reality in terms of, instead of having to die and losing almost everything you know and having to start over, what if you didn't? What if you could transmute your consciousness into another body and then have all of your memories and experiences and knowledge retained into that next body?
The fact that what you just stated right there, I remember back when, I don't know, just a few years ago, where reincarnation was enough. Well, recently I've come to realize that you can free yourself even from that through a process of enlightenment by looking inside, which is called the divine union. But there is, like you said, there is a way to hold on to your consciousness so today can live on through time into the days of tomorrow. And
that's right.
It's stated in the tablets over and over again.
That's right. And we're gonna get into that specifically, is how can you get beyond the system that's here, this system incarnation? Is it possible for you to not be incarnated again? As hard as that is to try to wrap your head around, what if you, in this lifetime, you were able to do certain things and accomplish certain things, both eternally and outwardly, where you could somehow ascend and become a different form of energy where you wouldn't have to come repeat this over and over again? And that's what this, I believe that this experience we're having really is it's a place where people are supposed to grow and learn. Specifically states that, talks about how he, where he came from and how he basically rose above and beyond that cycle to become what he is now. And so I want to begin by reading Emerald Tablet number 1. I, Thoth the Atlantean, master of mysteries, keeper of records, mighty king, magician, living from generation to generation, being about to pass into the halls of Amente, set down for the guidance of those who are to come after, these mighty of the mighty wisdom of great Atlantis. In the great city of Kior, on the island of Undal, in a time far past, I began this incarnation. Not as the little men of the present age did, the mighty ones of Atlantis live and die, but rather from aeon to aeon did they renew their life in the halls of Amente, where the river of life flows eternally onward. 100 times 10 have I descended the dark way that led into light. And as many times have I ascended from the darkness into the light, my strength and power renewed. Now for a time I descend, and the men of Khem shall know me no more. But in a time yet unborn, I will rise again, mighty and potent, acquiring an accounting of those who left behind me. Then beware, if ye have falsely betrayed my teaching, for I shall cast ye down from your high estate, into the darkness of the caves from whence you came. Betray not my secrets to the men of the north, or the men of the south, lest my curse fall upon ye. Remember and heed my words, for surely will I return again, and require of thee that which ye guard. Even from beyond time and beyond death will I return, rewarding or punishing, as ye have repeated your trust. Great were my people in the ancient days, great beyond the conception of the little people now around me, knowing the wisdom of old, seeking far within the heart of infinity, knowledge that belonged to earth's youth. Wise were we the wisdom of the children of light who dwelled among us. Strong were we the power drawn from the eternal fire. And all of these, greatest among the children of men, was my father, Thothme, keeper of the great temple, link between the children of light, who dwelt within the temple of the races of men who inhabited the 10 islands. One of the things that's so difficult about this, much like many other ancient writings as well, is that they've actually been specifically written in many cases so that the information within them will only be able to be revealed by those who are truly supposed to understand it, because of their studying and their looking at understanding symbolically what was supposed to be said long ago. So a lot of this was written in parables and metaphors and hidden within symbolic representations. However, not everything is, in my opinion, is purely just symbolic. I think that one of the ways that they loved to write back then was so that they could both represent something on a linear level and on a non-linear level at the same time. That's the brilliance behind their work. And so I just want to bring up really quickly what he says specifically was that when he's writing this, he's actually writing it from the perspective of in Egypt. He says he's writing it when he was in Chem. So this is his knowledge he left behind when he left Atlantis. So he's in Chem and he's about to go into one of his cycle changes where he's going to go rest and then incarnate into another body. And he's leaving this message behind before he does. And that's what's so amazing about it. And he says specifically that his father of Atlantis, the keeper of the great temple, Thoth, was the link between the children of light who dealt in the temple and the races of men, okay, or who resided on the 10 islands of the world. That is a fascinating thing to wrap your head around, because it means basically that who he states are these children of light, these ancient ones, these ancient beings that I believe are the ones who had given this knowledge down long ago. They were only accessible by those who were part of these pyramid priests and these sages in these great temples. And the rest of society had no access to them or their knowledge. And I think that's one of the ways and one of the reasons why they've been considered just a myth and not real, because so much time has gone by that we have this whole idea of incarnation. But before that, we had this idea of disseminating knowledge. And the question is, where did that come from? How could you just find this rise of civilization that comes out of nowhere if it wasn't based on something that influenced them? We are here at this time period where we're going to have to decide what this path is going to be ahead of us. Will we understand and separate this physical body from our eternal energy? Or are we going to keep focusing on this Ka world, which is the physical world, this physical world that binds us? All of these teachings and wisdom coming into play where we can finally ascend beyond this and really reach what we were supposed to all along, which is higher states of energy and awareness of the universe and the purpose we have within that. And I want to just make a quick mention is on the new website I've made called thestageoftime.com. I added, it doesn't show it in the screenshot, but I added a whole page that covers a good amount of ancient writings, including the Atrahasis and the Enuma Elish. And the rest of them will be in the Stage of Time, the book, once it releases. But for now, those who want to have a place where the most accurate translations from experts like Stephanie Daly and George Smith, they can go to my website and go to ancient writings and have those present for whenever they want to read them, as well as please check out my YouTube page at Matthew LaCroix. And Steve's got a great YouTube page. Steve, go ahead and call out your YouTube page too.
Well, it's just a slightly slanted sleuth for the truth, and it is what it is. And that's all I'm after is the truth, the big T, the monad of everything. And that's what I think we're both after. And that's why I commend you, sir.
Thanks, Steve, and have a great day. And I appreciate all your support, my friend, and everyone else that supports us.